On the morning of October 28, 1963, workers began dismantling what had been for 53 years the principal gateway between Manhattan and the continental United States. Pennsylvania Station occupied the blocks between 7th and 8th Avenues, from 31st to 33rd Streets, 8 acres of midtown real estate supporting a structure whose main waiting room rose 150 feet to coffered ceilings modeled on the baths of Caracalla. The station's 32 Doric columns, each carved from pink Milford granite and standing 35 feet tall, had welcomed travelers arriving from Philadelphia, Washington, Chicago, and points beyond since November 1910. The tunnels beneath the Hudson and East Rivers that made the station possible represented an engineering achievement that had required boring through bedrock and river silt, constructing underwater tubes where none had existed, and electrifying operations at a scale unprecedented for American railroads. None of the infrastructure that made the station functional would be destroyed. The tunnels would continue operating, the tracks would remain in service, the platforms would persist, buried now beneath a different structure. What the demolition crews removed was the building itself, the granite, the travertine, the steel trusses, the glass-roofed train shed, and with it, the physical evidence of a design philosophy that treated railroad terminals as civic monuments rather than utilitarian sheds. The Pennsylvania Railroad had spent the equivalent of several billion contemporary dollars constructing the station and its tunnel complex. 53 years later, the same railroad would demolish its own monument because the economic logic that justified its construction had inverted. The building cost money to maintain. The land beneath it was worth more without the building than with it. The regulatory framework that governed the railroad's property rights drew no distinction between a warehouse and a cathedral. This analysis examines the destruction of Pennsylvania Station not as an act of vandalism or short-sightedness, but as the predictable outcome of a system whose foundational assumptions guaranteed that irreplaceable infrastructure would eventually be treated as disposable. The station's owners did not behave irrationally. They behaved precisely as the ownership structure, tax code, and regulatory environment instructed them to behave. The failure was not located in any single decision, but in the design of the institutional framework itself, a framework that provided no mechanism for recognizing that some assets, once destroyed, cannot be rebuilt at any price. The granite columns that ended their existence as landfill in the New Jersey Meadowlands represented fabrication techniques, material sources, and craft labor that no longer existed in the construction industry of 1963. The building's destruction was physically irreversible in a way that the destruction of ordinary commercial structures was not. How does a system designed to allocate capital efficiently produce an outcome that destroys irreplaceable value? The answer lies not in the malice or incompetence of individual actors, but in the architecture of the system itself, in the assumptions embedded in property law, corporate governance, and regulatory silence that made the demolition of Pennsylvania Station not merely possible, but under the circumstances economically rational. The Pennsylvania Railroad's decision to construct a Manhattan terminal emerged from a specific competitive context in which the railroad's lack of direct access to the nation's largest city represented a strategic vulnerability. Prior to 1910, passengers traveling from points south and west of New York arrived at terminals in Jersey City or Hoboken and transferred to ferries for the final crossing to Manhattan. The New York Central Railroad, by contrast, operated Grand Central Terminal at 42nd Street, accessible by land via tracks running down the Harlem River Valley. The Central's geographic advantage, direct access to Manhattan without requiring passengers to change modes, represented a competitive asymmetry that the Pennsylvania Railroad's management sought to eliminate. Alexander Cassatt, who assumed the presidency of the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1899, authorized the tunneling and terminal project that would resolve this disadvantage. The scope of the undertaking exceeded anything previously attempted in American railroad construction. The plan required boring 2 single-track tunnels beneath the Hudson River from New Jersey to Manhattan, constructing a terminal station in Midtown, and then continuing with 4 additional tunnels beneath the East River to reach a storage yard in Queens. The Hell Gate Bridge, completed in 1917, would eventually connect this Queens yard to the New Haven Railroad's tracks in the Bronx, permitting through service from Washington to Boston without requiring passengers to change trains in Manhattan. The technical challenges were substantial. The Hudson River tunnels required construction through river silt under compressed air, a dangerous process that produced multiple fatalities among the tunneling crews. The East River tunnels passed through harder rock, but still required innovative engineering to maintain stability during construction. The terminal itself demanded the excavation of millions of cubic yards of Manhattan schist to create the below-grade track level, followed by the construction of the station building above. The Pennsylvania Railroad acquired the Long Island Railroad in 1900, specifically to gain access to the Queens Yard site and to integrate Long Island commuter traffic into the new terminal's operations. The resulting infrastructure represented one of the largest capital investments any American corporation had undertaken. The costs were justified not by the revenue the station building itself would generate. Terminal buildings do not directly produce income, but by the competitive position the integrated system would create. The tunnels eliminated the ferry transfer that had disadvantaged the Pennsylvania Railroad relative to the New York Central. The terminal provided a Manhattan presence commensurate with the railroad's self-image as the nation's premier carrier. The design, by McKim, Mead and White, drew explicitly on Roman imperial architecture, signaling permanence, stability, and civic importance. Within this investment logic, the station building functioned as an operational necessity and a corporate symbol, not as a revenue-generating asset. The tunnels and tracks produced transportation revenue. The building provided the interface between passengers and trains. Its monumental character served marketing and public relations functions that the railroad's management considered valuable, but that appeared nowhere in the capital accounting as separable income streams. The building existed because the tunnels required a surface expression, because passengers needed a place to wait and purchase tickets, and because the Pennsylvania Railroad wished to project an image of institutional permanence. None of these functions generated revenue independent of the underlying transportation service. The property ownership structure that governed the terminal site treated the station building and the land beneath it as a unified commercial asset. The Pennsylvania Railroad held fee simple title to the entire complex land, building, tunnels, and tracks. Under New York property tax law, the railroad owed annual assessments based on the assessed value of the property, which reflected both the land's location in Midtown Manhattan and the improvements constructed upon it. The station building, for property tax purposes, was an improvement, something the railroad had built on the land that increased the property's value and therefore increased its tax liability. This ownership and taxation structure embedded an assumption that would prove fatal to the building's survival, the assumption that the owner's private interests and the public's interest in the building's preservation would remain aligned. So long as the Pennsylvania Railroad operated profitably and valued the station's symbolic functions, this alignment held. The railroad maintained the building, paid the taxes, and preserved the structure as a matter of corporate identity. But the ownership structure provided no mechanism for what would happen if conditions changed, if the railroad's financial position deteriorated, if the symbolic value of the building declined in management's estimation, or if the land's value for alternative uses exceeded its value as a railroad terminal. No legal framework existed to distinguish the Pennsylvania station building from any other commercial structure the railroad might own. A railroad could demolish a freight shed when it no longer needed the shed. It could sell a maintenance facility when operations moved elsewhere. It could redevelop yard property when land values made alternative uses more attractive. The law governing these transactions drew no distinction based on the architectural or historical character of the structures involved. A building was a building. An owner could demolish an owner's building. The concept of landmarks preservation, The idea that certain structures possessed public value sufficient to constrain private property rights had no legal existence in New York City in 1962. The foundational design assumption, therefore, was not merely that the Pennsylvania Railroad would always want to preserve its terminal building. The assumption was that no mechanism was needed to ensure preservation because private ownership would adequately protect public interests. This assumption proved false not because the Pennsylvania Railroad acted in bad faith, but because the assumption itself misunderstood the relationship between private ownership and public value for a certain category of infrastructure. Infrastructure whose value to the public could not be captured by the entity that owned it, and whose destruction would impose losses that property markets could not price. The station's design incorporated a second assumption that would compound the consequences of the first, the assumption of permanence in construction. McKim, Mead, and White designed the station to last indefinitely. The structural systems employed load-bearing masonry walls, riveted steel framing, monolithic granite cladding reflected construction practices optimized for durability rather than adaptability. The building could not be easily modified, expanded, or partially preserved. Its structural integrity depended on the completeness of its systems. The same characteristics that made the station impressive made it inflexible. The granite columns, for example, were not decorative appliques over a steel frame. They were structural elements whose fabrication required quarrying, transportation, and carving at a scale that the construction industry of 1963 could not replicate. The Milford Granite Quarry in Massachusetts that had supplied the original columns was no longer in operation. The skilled stonecutters who had carved the Corinthian capitals no longer existed as an available labor force. The coffered ceiling of the main waiting room employed construction techniques that had been superseded by more economical methods. Preserving the building would have required preserving it entirely. The interconnected nature of its structural and decorative systems precluded selective retention. This construction logic meant that the building's survival was binary. It would either be fully maintained or fully demolished. There was no intermediate option in which economically valuable portions could be retained while less valuable portions were removed. The all-or-nothing character of monumental construction created a preservation threshold that normal commercial structures did not face. An ordinary office building could be renovated, partially demolished, or adapted to new uses without destroying its essential character. Pennsylvania Station could not. The design premise therefore contained an internal contradiction that its creators did not anticipate. The station was built to last forever, using construction methods that precluded adaptation, under an ownership structure that provided no protection if the owner's interests diverged from the public interest, in a regulatory environment that drew no distinction between replaceable and irreplaceable structures. Every element of this system functioned exactly as designed. The system as a whole produced an outcome, the demolition of the building, that none of its designers intended, but that the system's logic made inevitable once external conditions changed. The external conditions that would trigger this outcome were already developing when the station opened in 1910, though their consequences would not become apparent for decades. The automobile, the airplane, and the interstate highway system would progressively erode the market position that had justified the station's construction. The property tax burden that had been manageable when the railroad was profitable would become unsustainable when revenues declined. The real estate value of 8 acres of Midtown Manhattan would appreciate even as the railroad's ability to extract value from that land diminished. Each of these trends operated independently, but their convergence would create the conditions under which demolition became the economically rational choice. The system's designers could not have anticipated these specific developments. What they could have anticipated, what any system designer should anticipate, is that conditions change and that systems should include mechanisms for responding to changes in ways that preserve irreplaceable value. The Pennsylvania Station ownership structure included no such mechanism. It assumed that private ownership and public interest would remain aligned indefinitely, that no legal protection was needed for structures whose loss would be irreversible, and that property markets would efficiently allocate all categories of assets. Each of these assumptions proved false. The failure was not in the assumptions themselves, which reflected the conventional wisdom of their era, but in the absence of any feedback mechanism that could have corrected the assumptions before irreversible loss occurred. 9:10 p.m. The Pennsylvania Railroad that opened Pennsylvania Station in 1910 represented the largest and most financially powerful railroad corporation in the United States. Its main line connected New York with Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and St. Louis. Its subsidiary and affiliated lines extended this network throughout the eastern half of the continent. The railroad employed over 250,000 workers at its peak and operated more than 10,000 miles of track. Its management regarded the corporation not merely as a business enterprise, but as a quasi-public institution whose infrastructure formed the backbone of American commerce. The decision to construct Pennsylvania Station reflected this self-conception. The building was designed to communicate permanence, reliability, and civic importance at a scale commensurate with the railroad's estimation of its own significance. This institutional identity shaped the railroad's approach to the station for the first several decades of its operation. Maintenance budgets remained adequate, the building's appearance was preserved, the operational functions, ticketing, baggage handling, passenger circulation continued to work as designed. The station served as the railroad's public face in its most important market, and management allocated resources accordingly. The implicit assumption underlying these decisions was that the railroad's dominant market position would persist indefinitely, and that the station's symbolic value would continue to justify its maintenance costs. The conditions that would undermine this assumption began emerging almost immediately after the station opened, though their cumulative effect would not become decisive until mid-century. The first challenge came from the automobile. Henry Ford's Model T, introduced in 1908, began transforming American transportation patterns within years of Pennsylvania Station's completion. Automobile registrations in the United States increased from fewer than 500,000 in 1910 to over 8 million by 1920 and more than 23 million by 1930. Each automobile represented a household that could now travel medium distances, the distances that had previously generated much of the railroad's passenger revenue without purchasing a train ticket. The railroad industry's initial response to automobile competition was dismissive. Railroad executives regarded the automobile as suitable for local travel but irrelevant to the long-distance market that provided most passenger revenue. This assessment proved correct for a time. Through the 1920s, railroad passenger traffic remained robust, and Pennsylvania Station handled growing volumes of travelers. But the dismissive attitude prevented the industry from recognizing that the automobile was not merely competing for existing travel demand, but was creating new demand patterns that railroads could not serve: suburban commutes to dispersed employment centers, recreational travel on routes without rail service, and the flexibility of departure times that scheduled train service could not match. The Great Depression temporarily masked the structural shift in transportation markets. Automobile sales collapsed along with the broader economy, and many households that might have purchased cars in the 1930s deferred those purchases until after economic recovery. Railroad passenger traffic declined during the Depression, but this decline could be attributed to general economic conditions rather than modal competition. The railroad's financial distress during the 1930s, the Pennsylvania Railroad itself avoided bankruptcy, though many of its competitors did not, was understood as a cyclical phenomenon, rather than evidence of permanent market transformation. World War II produced a temporary reversal that further obscured the structural trends. Gasoline rationing and automobile production restrictions channeled travel demand back to railroads. Troop movements and war-related travel pushed passenger volumes to unprecedented levels. Pennsylvania Station operated at peak capacity throughout the war years, and the Pennsylvania Railroad's management could reasonably believe that the station's role in American transportation had been validated. The experience of wartime traffic provided a misleading baseline for post-war planning. The transportation transformation that had been developing since 1910 accelerated dramatically after 1945. Automobile production resumed with the end of wartime restrictions, and pent-up consumer demand produced a surge in car purchases. Automobile registrations in the United States increased from 26 million in 1945 to over 40 million by 1950 and continued rising throughout the decade. More significantly, the federal government began constructing the infrastructure that would make long-distance automobile travel practical for the first time. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 authorized construction of the interstate highway system, 41,000 miles of limited-access highways connecting every major American city. The federal government would fund 90% of construction costs, with states contributing the remaining 10%. The funding mechanism, a dedicated highway trust fund financed by gasoline taxes, created a self-reinforcing cycle in which highway use generated revenue for highway expansion, which enabled additional highway use, which generated additional revenue. No comparable federal investment supported railroad passenger service. The railroads operated on infrastructure they had built with private capital a half-century earlier, infrastructure that required ongoing maintenance expenditures that generated no government subsidy. Commercial aviation emerged as a second competitive threat during the same period. Airlines had operated passenger service since the 1920s, but technological limitations, limited range, small aircraft, high fares had restricted air travel to a niche market of time-sensitive business travelers and wealthy individuals. The introduction of pressurized cabins, more powerful engines, and larger aircraft during the late 1940s and 1950s transformed aviation from a premium service to a mass-market alternative to railroad travel. Jet aircraft, introduced on domestic routes beginning in 1958, reduced travel times between major cities to fractions of what railroads could offer. A passenger could fly from New York to Chicago in under 3 hours. The same journey by train required more than 15 hours. The Pennsylvania Railroad's passenger traffic declined steadily throughout the 1950s. Commuter services to New Jersey and Long Island suburbs remained reasonably well patronized, though even these routes faced competition from automobiles and highways. But the long-distance services that had justified the station's construction, the trains to Philadelphia, Washington, Chicago, and beyond, lost passengers year after year. The railroad continued operating these services, partly because regulatory requirements made discontinuation difficult, and partly because management believed that service reductions would accelerate the decline rather than arrest it. The financial consequences of declining ridership accumulated gradually. Passenger train operations had never been particularly profitable for American railroads. Freight services generated most railroad revenue and virtually all railroad profits. But passenger services had historically operated close to break-even, and the symbolic and political value of maintaining service had justified modest losses. As ridership declined, these modest losses became substantial losses. The Pennsylvania Railroad's passenger deficit widened throughout the 1950s, and management increasingly viewed passenger operations as a drain on corporate resources rather than a core business function. The station building itself became implicated in this financial deterioration. The property tax assessment on the Pennsylvania Station site reflected the value of 8 acres of Midtown Manhattan real estate, plus the value of the improvements constructed upon it. As Midtown land values appreciated during the post-war period, the railroad's property tax liability increased correspondingly. The railroad paid property taxes not on the basis of the income the station generated, but on the basis of what the property would be worth if put to its highest and best use, which, by the 1950s, was clearly not a railroad terminal. This disconnect between assessed value and operating economics created a structural trap. The station building added to the property tax burden without generating revenue to offset that burden. Maintaining the building in good condition actually increased the tax assessment and therefore increased the financial penalty for preservation. Deferring maintenance reduced assessed value and therefore reduced tax liability. The incentive structure created by property tax law systematically favored disinvestment. The Pennsylvania Railroad's management responded to these pressures in ways that reflected standard corporate financial practice. Maintenance budgets were reduced, capital improvements were deferred, the workforce responsible for the station's upkeep was cut. These decisions were individually rational responses to financial constraints, but their cumulative effect was to accelerate the building's physical and aesthetic deterioration. By the late 1950s, Pennsylvania Station had acquired a dingy, neglected appearance that contrasted sharply with its original grandeur. The ceiling of the main waiting room was coated with decades of accumulated grime. The travertine walls were discolored. The overall impression was one of institutional decline. The deteriorated condition of the building influenced how management perceived its value. A well-maintained Pennsylvania station might have been seen as an asset worth preserving, a corporate headquarters and public interface that communicated stability and success. A neglected Pennsylvania station communicated the opposite message. The building's condition became evidence supporting the conclusion that the building should be replaced rather than preserved. The feedback loop between deferred maintenance and reduced perceived value reinforced the trajectory toward demolition. Real estate developers began approaching the Pennsylvania Railroad with redevelopment proposals in the late 1950s. The proposals varied in specifics, but shared a common logic. The land beneath Pennsylvania Station was worth more than the station itself. Midtown Manhattan was experiencing an office construction boom. Modern air-conditioned office towers commanded premium rents. The railroad's property, with its excellent transit access and central location, could support millions of square feet of commercial space, generating millions of dollars in annual lease revenue. The station building, by contrast, generated no lease revenue and required ongoing maintenance expenditure. The arithmetic favored demolition. The railroad's board of directors evaluated these proposals against the backdrop of the corporation's broader financial challenges. The Pennsylvania Railroad's profitability had declined throughout the 1950s. Passenger losses continued to mount. Freight revenue faced increasing competition from trucking, which benefited from the same federal highway investments that had damaged passenger traffic. The railroad's capital position was deteriorating, and management faced pressure from shareholders to improve returns. Liquidating an underperforming asset to generate cash and reduce tax liability represented a straightforward application of corporate financial principles. No countervailing institutional voice existed to challenge this analysis. The railroad's board had a fiduciary obligation to shareholders, an obligation that courts had consistently interpreted as requiring directors to maximize financial returns. The board had no fiduciary obligation to preserve architecturally significant buildings, no obligation to consider the public interest in the station's survival, and no obligation to weigh intangible values against tangible financial pressures. The legal framework governing corporate decision-making provided no mechanism for introducing non-financial considerations into the analysis. External stakeholders who might have valued the building's preservation lacked standing to participate in the decision. New York City had no landmarks preservation law and therefore no regulatory authority to prevent demolition. The city's building department issued demolition permits based on structural and safety considerations, not aesthetic or historical ones. The state government exercised no oversight over railroad property decisions. The federal government, through the Interstate Commerce Commission, regulated railroad rates and service, but had no authority over railroad real estate transactions. Preservationist organizations existed, but possessed no legal tools to intervene in private property decisions. The training and professional formation of the railroad's decision-makers reinforced the trajectory toward demolition. Senior executives had been educated in engineering, law, and business administration. Their professional experience had taught them to evaluate decisions in terms of measurable costs and benefits, to discount intangible values that could not be quantified, and to focus on shareholder returns as the ultimate measure of managerial performance. Nothing in their training had prepared them to weigh the irreplaceable character of a monumental building against the measurable financial benefits of its demolition. The tools they had been given could not perform that calculation. The organizational culture of the Pennsylvania Railroad had also shifted during the decades since the station's construction. The executives who had authorized the station's construction in 1901, Alexander Cassatt and his generation, had seen themselves as builders of permanent infrastructure that would serve the nation for centuries. Their successors in the 1950s and 1960s saw themselves as managers of a struggling enterprise in a hostile competitive environment. The earlier generation's pride in monumental construction had given way to a more defensive orientation focused on cost reduction and survival. The station, which had once symbolized the railroad's ambitions, now symbolized the burden of maintaining an inherited infrastructure that no longer aligned with competitive realities. The human factors that shaped the demolition decision thus operated at multiple levels. At the level of individual decision-makers, rational analysis of quantifiable costs and benefits pointed toward demolition. At the level of organizational incentives, the corporate structure rewarded financial performance and provided no mechanism for valuing preservation. At the level of professional culture, the training and experience of railroad executives equipped them to optimize measurable outcomes rather than to weigh incommensurable values. At the level of regulatory environment, no external constraint existed to force consideration of the public interest in the building's survival. Each of these factors reinforced the others. Individual rationality aligned with organizational incentives, which aligned with professional norms, which aligned with regulatory silence. The system as a whole channeled decision-making toward a single outcome demolition without any actor behaving maliciously, irrationally, or even unusually. The Pennsylvania Railroad's management did what any similarly situated management would have done under similar circumstances. The failure was not in the managers, but in the system that gave them no alternative. The absence of any feedback mechanism that could have disrupted this trajectory represented the system's most consequential design flaw. Under different institutional arrangements, warning signals might have reached decision-makers before the decision became irreversible. A landmark's preservation law might have triggered regulatory review. A tax policy that distinguished between demolition of ordinary structures and demolition of irreplaceable ones might have altered the financial calculus. A corporate governance framework that recognized duties to non-shareholder stakeholders might have introduced preservationist considerations into board deliberations. A professional culture that valued historic preservation as a legitimate engineering concern might have generated internal opposition to demolition. None of these mechanisms existed. The system operated exactly as designed, and the design produced the destruction of Pennsylvania Station. The specific sequence of events that transformed the Pennsylvania Railroad's latent disposition toward demolition into an irreversible commitment began in 1961, when serious negotiations opened between the railroad and Madison Square Garden Corporation. The existing Madison Square Garden, located on 8th Avenue between 49th and 50th Streets, had operated since 1925 but faced its own obsolescence challenges. The arena's owners sought a new site that could accommodate a larger, more modern facility with better revenue-generating potential. The Pennsylvania Station property offered transit access superior to any alternative location in Manhattan. The railroad's willingness to consider demolition aligned with the arena developer's need for a cleared site. The convergence of these interests created the transactional framework that would determine the station's fate. The negotiations proceeded through 1961 and into early 1962 without public disclosure. The Pennsylvania Railroad's management treated the discussions as a routine real estate transaction, confidential business negotiations whose details would be announced when an agreement had been reached. No regulatory requirement mandated public notice or community input before a property owner could negotiate the demolition of its own building. The assumption embedded in property law that owners could dispose of their property as they saw fit operated to exclude public participation from the decision-making process entirely. The announcement came on July 21, 1962. The Pennsylvania Railroad disclosed that it had signed an agreement with Madison Square Garden Corporation under which the Arena Company would construct a new sports and entertainment complex above the station's track level. The existing station building would be demolished. The tracks, platforms, and tunnels would remain in service, but passengers would access them through a new structure, integrated into the arena and office development. The railroad would receive ground lease payments that would transform the property from a tax liability into a revenue-generating asset. The transaction, from the railroad's perspective, represented a straightforward optimization of an underperforming property. The terms of the agreement created immediate irreversibility. The railroad had signed binding commitments that obligated it to clear the site according to a specified timeline. Madison Square Garden Corporation had committed capital based on the expectation that the site would be available for construction. Breaking the agreement would expose the railroad to breach of contract liability and would strand the arena developers' invested planning costs. The transaction structure had been designed to provide both parties with certainty that the project would proceed as planned, that neither party would defect from the arrangement, and that the timeline would be maintained. This certainty, from a transactional perspective, was a feature. From a preservation perspective, it was the mechanism that foreclosed alternatives. The public learned of the station's pending destruction from newspaper accounts of the announcement. The New York Times reported the transaction in business section coverage that emphasized the financial terms and the modernization of the arena facility. The coverage reflected the newspaper's initial framing of the story. This was a real estate transaction, a business deal between private parties that warranted coverage in the business pages rather than as a civic or cultural event. The architectural and historical significance of the station building received limited attention in the initial reporting. The gap between the decision point and public awareness represented a critical feature of the failure sequence. By the time New Yorkers understood what was about to happen, the legal and financial architecture that would make it happen had already been constructed. The railroad had signed binding agreements. Capital had been committed. Timelines had been established. The window during which public opposition might have influenced the outcome had closed before most members of the public knew it was open. This sequencing was not accidental. It reflected the standard practice for large real estate transactions in which parties negotiate privately, reach agreement, and announce the completed deal. The practice assumes that private negotiations between willing parties produce efficient outcomes and that public involvement would introduce delay and uncertainty without corresponding benefit. For ordinary commercial transactions, this assumption may be defensible. For transactions involving irreplaceable civic assets, the assumption proves catastrophic because it excludes from the decision-making process the stakeholders whose interests are most directly affected. The public that learned of the demolition in July 1962 was not the same public that would have existed a decade earlier. The post-war period had seen growing awareness of historic preservation as a legitimate public concern. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, established by Congressional Charter in 1949, had begun building an institutional infrastructure for preservation advocacy. Urban renewal programs, which had demolished thousands of historic structures in cities across the country, had generated backlash from residents who questioned whether clearance and reconstruction produced better outcomes than rehabilitation and preservation. Jane Jacobs's The Death and Life of Great American Cities, published in 1961, had provided an intellectual framework for challenging the assumptions underlying large-scale urban redevelopment. This emergent preservation consciousness found institutional expression in the response to the Pennsylvania station announcement. Within weeks of the disclosure, a group of architects, critics, and civic leaders organized the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York, known by its acronym AGBENI. The group's founding members included prominent figures in the architectural establishment: Philip Johnson, the architect and curator who had helped introduce modernist architecture to American audiences; Aline Saarinen, the architecture critic and television correspondent; and a constellation of practicing architects, academics, and cultural commentators who recognized that the station's demolition would represent a loss extending far beyond the interests of the Pennsylvania Railroad or its passengers. AGBENI organized a protest campaign that combined public demonstrations with behind-the-scenes advocacy. On August 2, 1962, several hundred architects, artists, and concerned citizens picketed outside Pennsylvania Station, carrying signs that read, "Don't demolish it and save our heritage." The demonstration attracted media coverage and generated public attention, but it could not generate legal authority. The protesters had no standing to challenge the railroad's property rights. They could express opposition but could not compel the railroad to consider that opposition in its decision-making. The limitation of moral suasion as a preservation strategy became apparent as AGBENI sought institutional allies. The group approached New York City officials, requesting that the city take action to prevent demolition. The officials responded that they lacked authority to do so. New York City had no landmarks preservation law. The city's regulatory powers over buildings extended to safety, fire protection, and zoning compliance, not to architectural or historical merit. A property owner who obtained the necessary permits could demolish any structure, regardless of its significance, without municipal interference. AGBENI appealed to the state government, which possessed broader regulatory authority than the city. The state could, in theory, exercise eminent domain to acquire the station property and preserve it as a public asset. But eminent domain required compensation at fair market value, and the fair market value of 8 acres of Midtown Manhattan, now enhanced by the announced redevelopment plans, far exceeded any amount the state was prepared to spend on preservation. The state could also, in theory, enact legislation restricting demolition of historic structures. But no such legislation existed, and the timeline for passing new legislation extended well beyond the demolition schedule the railroad had announced. The federal government offered no preservation recourse. The National Historic Preservation Act, which would create a framework for federal involvement in preservation of historic properties, would not be enacted until 1966, 4 years after the demolition announcement and 3 years after demolition began. The Interstate Commerce Commission, which regulated railroad operations, had no authority over railroad real estate decisions that did not affect transportation service. The station's tracks and tunnels would continue operating. The regulatory framework addressed itself to transportation functions, not to the buildings that housed them. The architectural establishment, despite its sympathy for preservation, was divided on the question of Pennsylvania Station's merit. The station represented Beaux-Arts classicism, a design vocabulary that many modernist architects regarded as retrograde. Philip Johnson, who would become one of the most prominent voices against demolition, had himself championed the glass and steel aesthetic that defined post-war commercial architecture. The Museum of Modern Art, where Johnson had organized influential architecture exhibitions, had positioned itself in opposition to the historical eclecticism that Pennsylvania Station embodied. The preservation argument required defending a building that the architectural vanguard had spent decades criticizing. This internal division weakened the advocacy effort. Some architects who might have supported preservation on principle hesitated to defend a building they considered aesthetically flawed. Others argued that demolition would clear the way for a modern structure more appropriate to contemporary needs. The architectural profession's ambivalence about the station's design merit complicated the case for preservation and provided ammunition to those who characterized opposition as mere nostalgia. The preservation campaign encountered a more fundamental obstacle in the form of the transaction structure itself. The agreement between the Pennsylvania Railroad and Madison Square Garden Corporation was a private contract between willing parties. Neither party wished to terminate the agreement. The railroad wanted the lease revenue and the elimination of its maintenance burden. The arena developer wanted the site. No mechanism existed for a third party, whether Albany, the city, or any other entity, to intervene in a private contract to which it was not a party. Contract law treated the transaction as presumptively valid. The parties had negotiated at arm's length. The terms reflected their mutual assessment of value. The agreement would be enforced according to its terms, unless one of the parties sought to escape its obligations, and neither party sought any such escape. The legal system had been designed to facilitate and enforce private transactions, not to provide checkpoints at which non-parties could challenge transactions they found objectionable. The media coverage of the demolition controversy evolved as the story developed. Initial business page coverage gave way to feature articles exploring the station's history and architectural significance. Editorial writers began questioning whether demolition was appropriate, whether the city should intervene, and whether the transaction represented a failure of public policy. The New York Times, which had initially reported the announcement as a routine real estate transaction, published an editorial on August 4, 1962, that characterized the pending demolition as a monumental act of vandalism and called for reconsideration. But editorial opposition could not substitute for legal authority. The Times could criticize the demolition, it could not prevent it. The newspaper could call for the city to act, it could not compel the city to act. The newspaper could question the transaction's wisdom, it could not undo the contracts that had been signed. Media coverage generated public awareness and public sympathy, but public awareness and sympathy possessed no mechanism for translating into preservation of the building. The Pennsylvania Railroad's management responded to the protests with the patience of an institution that understood its legal position. The railroad's executives met with preservation advocates, listened to their concerns, and declined to modify the transaction. They pointed to the financial pressures the railroad faced, the contractual commitments it had undertaken, and the absence of any alternative that would address the property's economics. The meetings were courteous and unproductive. The railroad had no obligation to preserve the building and no intention of assuming such an obligation voluntarily. The divergence between public perception and legal reality represented the central feature of this phase of the failure sequence. The public perceived Pennsylvania Station as a civic asset, a shared inheritance whose fate should be determined through public deliberation. The legal system treated Pennsylvania Station as private property, a commercial asset whose fate was properly determined by its owner in pursuit of the owner's financial interests. These two frameworks were fundamentally incompatible, and the legal framework prevailed because it possessed enforcement mechanisms that the public perception framework lacked. The demolition contracts specified a timeline that would begin with removal of surface features in late 1963 and continue through the mid-1960s. The track level would remain operational throughout, with temporary passenger facilities constructed as the permanent facilities were demolished. The railroad estimated 3 years for complete demolition of the original structure and construction of the replacement facilities. By the time the protest movement had organized, trained its attention on the appropriate targets, and developed its arguments, the countdown to demolition had already begun. The decision had crystallized. The contracts had been signed. The capital had been committed. The legal framework provided no checkpoint at which the decision could be revisited. The public had been excluded from the deliberation by the timing of the announcement and the structure of the transaction. Every institutional actor with authority to intervene had declined to do so, or lacked the legal power to do so effectively. Pennsylvania Station's fate had been determined, and nothing that happened after July 1962 could change that determination. The demolition of Pennsylvania Station began on October 28, 1963, 15 months after the public announcement and 14 months after the organized protest movement had formed. The delay between announcement and demolition had not produced any modification to the transaction terms. The legal challenges that preservation advocates had hoped to mount had failed to materialize because no legal basis for challenge existed. The political interventions they had sought had not occurred because no political actor possessed authority to intervene effectively. The demolition proceeded according to the timeline the Pennsylvania Railroad and Madison Square Garden Corporation had established in their original agreement. The sequence of physical destruction followed a logic dictated by the building's structural systems and the operational requirement that track-level functions continue throughout the demolition process. The station's design separated the monumental public spaces from the utilitarian track level, with the waiting room, concourse, and ticketing facilities occupying the upper portions of the structure, while the platforms and tracks occupied the excavated volume below. This separation permitted the developers to remove the upper structure while maintaining train service, but it also meant that the demolition would proceed from the top down, beginning with the elements that gave the station its architectural character and concluding with the structural framework that supported them. The demolition crews began with the ornamental features that could be removed without compromising structural integrity. The bronze chandeliers that had illuminated the main waiting room were detached and lowered. The carved stone eagles that had adorned the exterior facades were pried from their positions. The ironwork, the decorative metalwork, the carved inscriptions, all were stripped away in the initial phases of demolition. Some of these elements were salvaged by collectors, architectural salvage dealers, or the railroad itself, which retained certain artifacts for historical display. Most were discarded. The fate of the salvaged elements illustrated the gap between the station's assessed value as real estate and its potential value as a collection of irreplaceable artifacts. The bronze eagles, carved by Adolf Weinman and weighing several tons each, possessed historical and artistic significance that the demolition process treated as incidental. Some eagles were preserved, others were melted for scrap. The disposition depended on whether a buyer could be found before the demolition schedule required clearance of the site, not on any systematic assessment of the artifact's significance or replaceability. The granite columns presented a more complex demolition challenge. The 32 Doric columns of the 7th Avenue facade, each carved from a single block of Milford granite and standing 35 feet tall, could not be easily moved or repurposed. Their scale exceeded the capacity of standard rigging equipment. Their weight made transportation costly. Their dimensions suited them for monumental construction of a type that the 1960s construction industry did not practice. No buyer materialized for the columns, and no preservation organization possessed the resources to acquire and store them pending some future use. The columns were demolished in place and transported as rubble to the Secaucus Meadowlands in New Jersey, where they joined other construction debris in landfill operations. The granite that had been quarried in Massachusetts, transported to New York, carved by skilled stonecutters, and erected to frame the entrance to the nation's busiest passenger terminal, ended its existence beneath the surface of a New Jersey marsh. The disposal method reflected the economic assessment that had governed the entire transaction. The columns possessed no value that exceeded the cost of their removal and disposition. The physical process of column removal required drilling, blasting, and mechanical demolition. The granite fractured along the drill lines and fell in sections that could be loaded onto trucks. The controlled destruction of material that had been designed to endure for centuries required only a few weeks to accomplish. The asymmetry between construction duration and demolition duration, 6 years to build, a fraction of that to destroy, underscored the irreversibility of the process. The station had been assembled from components that no longer existed in the construction supply chain and using techniques that no longer existed in the construction labor force. The main waiting room's demolition revealed the structural principles that had made the space possible. The room's 150-foot height had been achieved through a combination of load-bearing masonry walls and steel framing that distributed loads to the foundation. The coffered ceiling, which had appeared to float above the space, was supported by a network of steel trusses concealed within the architectural envelope. As the demolition proceeded, these structural elements became visible for the first time since the building's construction, revealing the engineering that had enabled the architectural expression. The steel was salvaged for recycling. Unlike the granite, steel possessed commodity value that exceeded its removal cost. The structural members that had supported the ceiling and walls were cut with torches, lowered to ground level, and trucked to scrapyards where they would be melted and reformed into new steel products. The material would persist in transformed state. The structural system it had comprised would not. The travertine that had clad interior walls presented intermediate characteristics between the granite and the steel. Travertine possessed material value, and architectural salvage dealers expressed interest in acquiring sections for resale. But the volume of travertine involved, combined with the demolition timeline, prevented systematic salvage. Some panels were removed intact and entered the architectural salvage market. Most were broken during demolition and disposed of as construction debris. The glass and steel train shed that had covered the platform area represented a different structural category from the Beaux-Arts waiting room. The shed's design, derived from 19th-century railroad station precedents, employed a steel framework supporting glass panels that admitted natural light to the platform level. This functional space, less architecturally celebrated than the waiting room but essential to the station's operation, was demolished along with the rest of the structure. The glass was shattered during removal. The steel framing joined the structural steel in the scrap stream. The demolition proceeded through 1964 and into 1965, with the schedule adjusted to maintain continuous rail operations. Temporary facilities were constructed to handle passenger ticketing and circulation as permanent facilities were removed. The track level remained functional throughout, demonstrating that the infrastructure the Pennsylvania Railroad had built in 1910 could continue serving its transportation purpose independent of the monumental building above it. The tunnels, tracks, and platforms required no modification. Only the building that had given those functional elements their architectural expression would be destroyed. Photographers documented the demolition process with an intensity that the construction process had not received. The construction of Pennsylvania Station in the first decade of the 20th century had been photographed, but the images were primarily engineering documentation records of excavation progress, structural erection, and mechanical installation. The demolition photographs served a different purpose. They recorded the destruction of something recognized as irreplaceable. The photographs captured the gap between what the station had been and what remained as demolition progressed. The images that circulated during and after the demolition period emphasized the contrast between the station's monumental character and the indignity of its destruction. Photographs showed carved eagles being lowered by crane, granite columns lying in fragments, the waiting room ceiling opening to the sky as sections were removed. These images became the visual archive of a loss that could not be reversed, evidence that preservation advocates would deploy in subsequent campaigns to prevent similar outcomes. The physics of the demolition process operated on timescales that made intervention impossible once the process began. The removal of a column section once initiated could not be paused and reversed. The cutting of a steel beam once completed could not be undone. Each demolition action was individually irreversible, and the cumulative effect of thousands of individually irreversible actions was the complete elimination of a structure that had required 6 years and the equivalent of billions of dollars to construct. The materials that composed the station dispersed through the material economy according to their commodity value. Steel entered the recycling stream and emerged as new steel products. Bronze was melted and recast, granite became landfill, travertine panels that found buyers persisted as architectural fragments in contexts remote from their original setting. The physical substance of the station was not annihilated, it was transformed and scattered, losing in the process the organized relationships that had constituted the building. The knowledge embedded in the station's construction dispersed as completely as the materials. The stonecutters who had carved the ornamental details had retired or died. The fabrication techniques they had employed had been superseded by more economical methods. The quarries that had supplied the granite had closed. The supply chains that had delivered materials to the construction site no longer existed. Reconstructing the station would have required not merely procuring materials and hiring labor, but reconstituting an entire industrial ecosystem that had dissolved over the half-century since original construction. This dissolution of construction knowledge represented a form of irreversibility distinct from the physical destruction of materials. A building destroyed by fire or earthquake can, in principle, be reconstructed if records survive and if the construction techniques remain available. Pennsylvania Station could not be reconstructed even in principle because the techniques no longer existed. The guild knowledge that master stonecutters had possessed, transmitted through apprenticeship over generations, had no modern equivalent. The building had been designed for permanence, using methods optimized for permanence, and those methods had become obsolete precisely because they were optimized for permanence rather than economy. The demolition concluded in 1966 with the removal of the final structural elements and the clearance of the site for new construction. The new Madison Square Garden, a circular arena structure designed in the late modern idiom, rose above the tracks that had served Pennsylvania Station. 2 Penn Plaza, an office tower, occupied the remainder of the site. The new structures sat atop the tunnel and track infrastructure that the Pennsylvania Railroad had constructed in 1910, infrastructure that continued functioning as designed despite the elimination of the building that had originally enclosed it. The replacement structures made no reference to what they had replaced. The architectural vocabulary of the new building's precast concrete, aluminum curtain walls, functional geometries bore no relationship to the Beaux-Arts classicism of the demolished station. The circulation patterns for passengers changed. Instead of entering through a monumental waiting room that announced the significance of rail travel, passengers descended through low-ceilinged corridors to reach platforms that now occupied the basement of a sports arena. The experience of arriving in New York by train had been transformed from a civic ceremony to an underground transfer. The physical evidence of what had been lost became progressively harder to locate as the demolition site was cleared and built over. The photographs remained. The salvaged artifacts persisted in scattered locations. But the spatial experience of Pennsylvania Station, the experience of standing in a room 150 feet tall, illuminated by natural light through lunette windows, surrounded by granite columns that had been carved by craftsmen whose skills no longer existed, could no longer be accessed. The photographs documented the building's appearance but could not replicate its presence. The failure chain had completed its operation. Design assumptions that provided no protection for irreplaceable assets had interacted with financial pressures that made demolition economically rational. Organizational incentives had aligned with regulatory absence to produce a decision pathway with no checkpoints. The sequencing of private negotiations had excluded public participation until after irreversible commitments had been made, and the physics of demolition had transformed a 6-year construction achievement into rubble in less than 3 years. Each phase had followed logically from the preceding phase. The system had functioned exactly as designed. 9:16 p.m. The organized response to Pennsylvania Station's demolition operated under constraints that its participants understood imperfectly at the time. The Action Group for Better Architecture in New York had formed in the immediate aftermath of the July 1962 announcement, mobilizing with a speed that reflected genuine alarm among architects and preservationists. The group's founding members possessed professional credentials, media access, and connections to New York's cultural establishment. They believed, reasonably, that these assets would provide leverage sufficient to alter the outcome. The belief proved mistaken, but the reasons for its failure would become clear only through the attempt. Agbany's initial strategy combined public demonstration with elite persuasion. The August 1962 picket line outside Pennsylvania Station generated newspaper coverage and signaled that the architectural profession opposed demolition. Simultaneously, the group's leadership sought meetings with Pennsylvania Railroad executives, New York City officials, and state government representatives who might possess authority to intervene. The strategy assumed that decision-makers would respond to reasoned argument and public pressure, that the combination of professional expertise and civic concern would create space for reconsideration. The meetings with Pennsylvania Railroad management revealed the limits of moral suasion. The railroad's executives were not indifferent to the preservationists' concerns. They were constrained by commitments already made. The agreements with Madison Square Garden Corporation created obligations that the railroad could not unilaterally abandon. Breaking the contracts would expose the railroad to liability that its financial condition could not absorb. The executives explained these constraints with apparent sincerity. They were not refusing to listen. They were explaining why listening could not produce the outcome the preservationists sought. The meetings with city officials revealed a different constraint: the absence of legal authority. New York City possessed extensive regulatory powers over buildings, powers governing construction, occupancy, fire safety, and structural integrity. But these powers addressed safety and welfare, not aesthetics or historical significance. The city could prevent construction of an unsafe building. It could not prevent demolition of a significant one. Officials expressed sympathy for preservation concerns while explaining that sympathy could not substitute for statutory authority. The state government possessed broader powers than the city, including the power of eminent domain that could theoretically be employed to acquire the station property. But eminent domain required compensation at fair market value, and the fair market value of the Pennsylvania Station site had increased substantially following the announcement of the Madison Square Garden project. The state would need to pay not merely the value of the property as a railroad terminal, but the enhanced value reflecting development potential. No state official was prepared to recommend such an expenditure for preservation purposes. Agbany explored litigation as an alternative to political intervention. The group consulted attorneys about potential legal theories that might support an injunction against demolition. The attorneys' assessment was discouraging. The railroad owned the property. The railroad had obtained necessary permits. No statute restricted the railroad's right to demolish its own building. The contracts with Madison Square Garden Corporation were valid agreements between willing parties. The legal system provided no cause of action that a preservationist organization could assert against a property owner proceeding lawfully. The absence of legal recourse reflected a gap in the regulatory framework that the preservation movement had not previously confronted at this scale. Historic preservation in the United States had developed primarily through private initiative, through organizations like the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which had preserved George Washington's estate, or the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, which had acquired and maintained significant buildings. These efforts succeeded because willing sellers transferred properties to preservation-minded buyers. The Pennsylvania Station situation presented a different problem: an unwilling owner proceeding to destroy a property that no preservation organization could afford to acquire. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, established by congressional charter in 1949, possessed institutional resources that local organizations lacked. But the National Trust operated primarily through education, advocacy, and technical assistance, not through legal intervention. The Trust could publicize the threat to Pennsylvania Station and could mobilize preservationist sentiment nationally, but it possessed no enforcement authority that could override the Pennsylvania Railroad's property rights. The limitations that Agbany encountered were structural, not contingent. A better organized campaign, more prominent supporters, or more sophisticated media strategy would not have altered the outcome. The outcome was determined by the legal framework, and the legal framework provided no mechanism for the preservation outcome the advocates sought. The campaign's failure was not a failure of execution, but a failure of available tools. The recognition of this structural limitation prompted Agbany's leadership to shift strategy. If Pennsylvania Station could not be saved, perhaps its destruction could catalyze legal reform that would prevent similar losses in the future. The campaign increasingly emphasized the need for landmarks preservation legislation, a law that would create the regulatory authority that the Pennsylvania Station controversy had revealed to be absent. New York City Mayor Robert Wagner had expressed general support for preservation principles, though he had taken no action to prevent the station's demolition. Agbany pressed the mayor to establish a commission to study landmarks preservation and to recommend legislation. The mayor acceded, creating the Mayor's Committee for the Preservation of Structures of Historic and Aesthetic Importance in August 1962. The committee's mandate was prospective rather than retrospective. It would develop a framework for future preservation, not intervene in the Pennsylvania Station situation. The committee's work proceeded through 1962 and 1963 as the demolition proceeded. The parallel timelines underscored the gap between the legislative process and the physical destruction. The framework that might have saved Pennsylvania Station was being designed while the station was being demolished. The committee's deliberations addressed the legal, administrative, and constitutional questions that any landmarks preservation law would need to resolve. How would significant properties be identified? What restrictions would designation impose on owners? What compensation, if any, would owners receive for restricted property rights? How would the law survive constitutional challenge under the Takings Clause? These questions proved more complex than the preservation advocates had initially appreciated. A landmarks law that designated properties without owner consent would impose restrictions that owners might characterize as regulatory takings requiring compensation. The compensation requirement could render the law fiscally unworkable, since the city would need to pay owners the difference between unrestricted and restricted property values. Alternatively, a law that avoided compensation requirements might be struck down as an unconstitutional taking without just compensation. The committee developed a framework that attempted to navigate these constitutional constraints. Designation would be based on criteria specified in the law: architectural significance, historical importance, and aesthetic merit, rather than on ad hoc political judgments. The designation process would include notice to owners and opportunity for hearing. Owners of designated properties would be restricted from demolishing or significantly altering their buildings without approval from a preservation commission. The commission could deny demolition permits if the building met the designation criteria and if the owner could not demonstrate that preservation would deprive them of all reasonable economic use. This final provision, the reasonable economic return test, represented the committee's effort to satisfy constitutional requirements. The law would not require owners to maintain unprofitable properties indefinitely. It would require only that demolition be permitted when preservation would impose undue economic hardship. The test attempted to balance preservation interests against property rights in a manner that courts might find constitutionally permissible. The committee completed its work and submitted recommendations in late 1964. The New York City Council took up the proposed legislation in early 1965, debating provisions and considering amendments. The legislative process consumed months as various interests sought modifications. Real estate developers opposed provisions that would restrict their flexibility. Preservationists pressed for stronger protections. Property rights advocates questioned the law's constitutionality. The Council's deliberations reflected the genuine difficulty of crafting legislation that would achieve preservation objectives while respecting constitutional limits. The New York City Landmarks Law passed in April 1965 and took effect immediately. The law created the Landmarks Preservation Commission. empowered to designate individual buildings and historic districts for protection. Owners of designated properties were prohibited from demolishing or significantly altering their buildings without commission approval. The commission could deny permits if the proposed work would destroy significant features unless the owner demonstrated that denial would deprive them of reasonable economic return. The law came too late for Pennsylvania Station. By April 1965, the station's demolition was substantially complete. The granite columns had been removed, the waiting room had been demolished, the steel framework had been cut and scrapped. The site was transitioning from demolition to new construction. The law that Pennsylvania Station's destruction had catalyzed could not reach backward to prevent the loss that had prompted its enactment. But the law created the framework that would govern future preservation controversies. The Landmarks Preservation Commission began designating significant buildings immediately upon its creation, establishing a protected inventory that demolition-minded owners could not eliminate without regulatory approval. The Commission's early designations included Grand Central Terminal, which faced development pressure similar to what Pennsylvania Station had experienced. The Penn Central Transportation Company, successor to the Pennsylvania Railroad, had proposed construction of an office tower above Grand Central that would have substantially altered the terminal's character. The Grand Central situation provided the test case for the new landmarks law. Penn Central challenged the Commission's denial of its development proposal, arguing that the landmarks law constituted a taking of property without just compensation. The litigation proceeded through state courts, with Penn Central losing at each level. The company appealed to the United States Supreme Court, which agreed to hear the case. The Supreme Court's decision in Penn Central Transportation Company versus City of New York, issued in 1978, resolved the constitutional questions that had shadowed landmarks preservation law since its inception. The court upheld the New York City law, finding that landmark designation did not constitute a taking requiring compensation. The reasonable economic return test, the court concluded, adequately protected property owners' constitutional rights while permitting cities to preserve architecturally and historically significant buildings. The Penn Central decision established the constitutional foundation for landmarks preservation nationwide. Cities that had hesitated to enact preservation legislation for fear of takings challenges could proceed with confidence that appropriately designed laws would survive judicial review. The framework that the 1962 Pennsylvania Station controversy had revealed to be absent now existed, validated by the nation's highest court. The Supreme Court case bore the name of the railroad that had demolished Pennsylvania Station. Penn Central Transportation Company, formed from the 1968 merger of the Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central Railroad, had inherited both companies' properties and their approaches to property management. The same corporate entity that had destroyed Pennsylvania Station now found itself constrained by the law that destruction had prompted. The irony was structural rather than intentional. The legal framework that emerged from the 1962 controversy applied to all property owners, including the successor to the owner whose actions had necessitated the framework's creation. The physical evidence of what Pennsylvania Station had been persisted in fragmentary form after the building itself ceased to exist. Photographs documented the station's appearance throughout its operational life and during its demolition. Architectural drawings survived in archives, preserving the design intent that McKim, Mead and White had realized in granite and steel. Salvaged artifacts, eagles, ornamental metalwork, fragments of carved stone scattered to collectors, museums, and architectural salvage yards. These remnants constituted the forensic record of a structure that could no longer be directly examined. The photographs that had documented the demolition acquired documentary significance that their creators had not fully anticipated. The images of granite columns lying in fragments, of carved eagles suspended from cranes, of the waiting room ceiling open to the sky became the visual vocabulary through which subsequent generations would understand what had been lost. The photographs could not replicate the spatial experience of the building, but they could establish that the building had existed, that it had possessed specific physical characteristics, and that those characteristics had been deliberately destroyed. The salvaged artifacts presented a different evidentiary category. The eagles that had adorned the exterior facades possessed physical continuity with the original building. They were not representations of the station, but fragments of it, their dispersal to various locations, some to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, some to private collectors, some to locations that would not be documented, meant that the physical evidence of the station's existence would persist, but in a condition that precluded reassembly. The fragments could prove that Pennsylvania Station had existed and could demonstrate the quality of its craftsmanship, but they could not restore the relationships among components that had constituted the building. The architectural drawings preserved in archives documented the design intent more completely than either photographs or artifacts. The drawings showed plans, elevations, sections, and details at scales sufficient for construction. A future generation with access to the drawings could understand exactly how the building had been designed, what materials had been specified, and how the various systems had been intended to interact. The drawings could not, however, document the construction knowledge that had transformed the drawings into the building. The gap between design intent and constructed reality, the gap that skilled craftsmen had bridged through techniques transmitted by apprenticeship, remained undocumented because it had been embodied in practice rather than recorded in documents. The forensic assessment of what had been lost extended beyond the physical building to encompass the construction ecosystem that had produced it. The Milford Granite Quarry in Massachusetts, which had supplied the stone for the exterior columns, had ceased operations. The quarry's closure was not directly caused by Pennsylvania Station's demolition, but it illustrated the broader dissolution of the material supply chains that had supported monumental construction. Granite of the specific character used in the station's columns was no longer commercially available in the quantities and dimensions required. The skilled labor force that had carved the station's ornamental stonework had similarly dissolved. Stone carving as a construction trade had declined throughout the 20th century as architectural styles shifted away from applied ornament and as cost pressures favored standardized components over custom fabrication. The master carvers who had produced the station's Corinthian capitals, its carved friezes, and its decorative details had trained apprentices during the early decades of the century, but the apprenticeship pipeline had contracted as demand for the skills declined. By the 1960s, the labor pool capable of producing ornamental stonework at the scale and quality of Pennsylvania Station had effectively ceased to exist. This dissolution of construction capacity meant that the station's destruction was irreversible, in a sense beyond the physical destruction of materials. Even if the materials had been preserved intact, if the granite columns had been stored rather than landfilled, if the steel framing had been warehoused rather than scrapped, reassembly would have required techniques that no longer existed in the construction industry. The building could not be reconstructed because the construction knowledge required for reconstruction had been lost along with the building itself. The irreversibility extended to the architectural knowledge embedded in the design. McKim, Mead and White had ceased to exist as a firm. The partners who had designed the station had died. The design sensibility that had produced the station, the synthesis of Beaux-Arts principles with American civic ambition, had fallen out of fashion and out of practice. Contemporary architects trained in modernist principles could study the station's drawings and understand the design intellectually, but they could not replicate the design judgment that had produced the proportions, the ornamental programs, and the spatial sequences. Design knowledge, like construction knowledge, was embedded in practice and transmitted through mentorship. It could not be fully reconstructed from documentary evidence. The regulatory response to Pennsylvania Station's destruction constituted the most substantial long-term outcome of the loss. The New York City Landmarks Law of 1965 created an institutional framework that had not existed in 1962. The framework included a commission with authority to designate significant properties, restrictions on alteration or demolition of designated properties, and procedural requirements that gave preservation interests standing in development decisions. The law addressed the structural absence that the Pennsylvania Station controversy had exposed. The law's effectiveness was tested almost immediately. Grand Central Terminal, the New York Central Railroad's counterpart to Pennsylvania Station, faced development pressures that paralleled those that had destroyed the Pennsylvania Station. Penn Central Transportation Company, the merged successor to both railroads, proposed construction of an office tower above the terminal that would have significantly altered its character. The Landmarks Preservation Commission, exercising its newly granted authority, denied the proposal on the grounds that the tower would destroy the terminal's architectural integrity. Penn Central's challenge to the Commission's denial produced the litigation that would ultimately reach the Supreme Court. The company argued that the Landmarks law deprived it of property rights without compensation, that the denial of its development proposal constituted a regulatory taking under the Fifth Amendment. The case proceeded through state courts, with Penn Central losing at each level before reaching the Supreme Court in 1978. The Supreme Court's decision in Penn Central Transportation Company versus City of New York established the constitutional framework for landmarks preservation that would govern subsequent decades. The court rejected Penn Central's takings argument, finding that the landmarks law did not require compensation because it did not deprive the company of all reasonable economic use of its property. The terminal could continue operating as a terminal, the company could continue earning revenue from its transportation functions. Only the incremental value of the proposed tower development was affected by the designation. The court's analysis established several principles that would shape preservation law nationally. Landmark designation did not automatically require compensation merely because it reduced property value. The relevant inquiry was whether the designation deprived the owner of all economically beneficial use, not whether it reduced value or prevented the most profitable use. Preservation of historic buildings served legitimate public purposes that governments could pursue through regulatory means. The reciprocal benefits of landmark preservation, the enhanced value that owners derived from designation of neighboring properties, offset some of the burden that designation imposed on individual owners. The Penn Central decision validated the regulatory approach to preservation that the 1965 New York City law had pioneered. Cities and states that had hesitated to enact preservation legislation because of constitutional uncertainty could proceed with confidence that appropriately designed laws would survive judicial challenge. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, enacted the year after the New York City law, created a federal framework that complemented state and local efforts. The combination of federal, state, and local preservation authority that emerged after 1965 represented a fundamental shift in the legal treatment of historic properties. The shift had come too late for Pennsylvania Station. The building's destruction had occurred in the gap between the recognition that preservation authority was needed and the creation of that authority. The station had been sacrificed to the absence of a legal framework that its sacrifice would help create. This temporal relationship, the loss that catalyzes the reform that would have prevented the loss, recurs throughout the history of safety and preservation regulation. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire produced fire safety codes. The Iroquois Theater Fire produced theater safety regulations. The Titanic produced maritime safety requirements. Pennsylvania Station produced landmarks preservation law. The lesson embedded in this pattern concerns the relationship between system design and catastrophic loss. Systems designed without adequate safeguards will produce losses that could have been prevented by safeguards that the losses subsequently motivate. The safeguards emerged too late for the losses that demonstrated their necessity. The pattern suggests that proactive identification of system vulnerabilities, anticipating losses before they occur, produces better outcomes than reactive reform after catastrophic failure. But proactive reform requires recognizing vulnerabilities in advance. And the Pennsylvania station case illustrates how difficult such recognition can be when the vulnerability is embedded in foundational assumptions about property rights and market allocation. The ideology that had made Pennsylvania station's destruction possible, the assumption that private ownership adequately protected all categories of assets, did not disappear after the station's loss. The assumption persisted in modified form, constrained by landmarks laws but not eliminated. Property owners continued to resist designation of their properties. Developers continued to challenge preservation restrictions. The tension between property rights and preservation interests remained a permanent feature of land use regulation, managed through the frameworks that the 1960s reforms had established but not resolved. The station's destruction also influenced architectural culture in ways that extended beyond legal reform. The loss prompted reconsideration of modernist assumptions about the disposability of historic buildings. Architects, who had dismissed Beaux-Arts classicism as retrograde, began reconsidering its virtues. The preservation movement, which had operated at the margins of architectural discourse before 1962, gained institutional legitimacy and professional respectability. Schools of architecture incorporated preservation into curricula. The profession that had been ambivalent about Pennsylvania station's merit in 1962 increasingly recognized preservation as a legitimate architectural concern. The phrase most commonly associated with Pennsylvania station's destruction, "One entered the city like a god, one scuttles in now like a rat," captured the experiential dimension of the loss in terms that transcended architectural criticism. The speaker, the architectural historian Vincent Scully, was describing not merely the aesthetic qualities of the original building, but the civic meaning that monumental architecture could convey. The station had framed arrival in New York as an event of significance, a transition worthy of architectural acknowledgement. The replacement facilities framed arrival as a utilitarian transfer, a basement-level transition between transportation modes. The contrast between the two experiences illustrated what the destruction had cost beyond the loss of physical materials. The station had embodied a conception of public space and civic dignity that the replacement structures did not attempt. The loss was not merely architectural but ideological, a demonstration that the systems governing American cities did not reliably protect the physical expressions of civic aspiration. The demonstration prompted both the legal reforms that would constrain future losses and the cultural reassessment that would shape subsequent preservation efforts. Pennsylvania station's destruction thus functioned as a turning point in the history of American preservation, a loss whose magnitude and visibility catalyzed reforms that would prevent similar losses. The station could not be recovered, but its destruction was not without consequence. The legal framework that emerged from the controversy, the landmarks laws, the constitutional validation, the procedural requirements, represented the institutionalization of values that had possessed no institutional expression in 1962. The station's sacrifice purchased something, even if that something came too late to prevent the sacrifice itself. The forensic assessment of Pennsylvania station's destruction concludes with recognition of its structural character. The station was not destroyed by malice, incompetence, or accident. It was destroyed by a system that treated irreplaceable civic infrastructure identically to ordinary commercial property, that provided no mechanism for recognizing non-market value, and that allocated to private owners decisions whose consequences extended far beyond private interests. The individuals who made the decisions, the railroad executives, the developers, the city officials, operated within constraints that made their decisions rational, given the frameworks they inhabited. The failure was in the frameworks, not in the individuals. The reformation of those frameworks represents the station's most significant legacy. The legal structures that now protect historic buildings throughout the United States trace their constitutional validation to the Penn Central Decision, which arose from the preservation law that Pennsylvania station's destruction prompted. The station's loss created the conditions for preventing similar losses. The building itself could not be saved, But the principle that some buildings should be saved, and the legal mechanisms for translating that principle into enforceable protection, emerged from its destruction. The system failure produced system reform. The cost of that reform was the building that demonstrated the system's failure.